Hello and welcome to the first module of the course, Developing with Node.js on Microsoft Azure, Getting Started. My name is David Tucker, and I work every day with organizations to help them bring their visions to life in the cloud. And I'm excited that you're here joining me and looking at how you can take your Node.js applications and launch them into the cloud. Now, in this initial module, Fundamental Concepts, we're going to be covering the information that you need to know about Microsoft Azure to be able to progress through the remainder of this course. We're going to be looking at several things. For example, we will be exploring how Azure organizes their global infrastructure. In addition, we will be launching our first virtual server, and we'll be exploring the command line tools that are provided with Azure. And you'll be able to do all of this with your own account as you follow along. So I'm excited that you're here with me. Now let's dive into the course. So next, we're going to talk about how we leverage the power of the Azure platform. But before we get too deep into that, let's take a step back and look at what we're going to be covering here within this initial module. First of all, we're going to be reviewing the capabilities of the Azure platform. And as a part of that, we're going to be exploring a concept called Azure Regions and understanding how Microsoft organizes the global infrastructure for the platform. Then we'll be examining some different cloud computing models. And then we'll get into creating an Azure subscription so you can follow along with everything that we have in this course. Then we'll be accessing the Azure portal, we'll be launching a virtual machine, and then we'll be utilizing the Azure CLI or command line interface. So let's take a minute and begin to talk about what Azure is. So as a platform, Azure has many different services. We are only going to be using a very small percentage of those overall services. Let's talk about some of the different categories of services that are provided by the platform as a whole. So first of all, we have storage. And there are multiple services that are provided for you on the platform that can enable you to store your data in the cloud. In addition, there are multiple services that provide compute capabilities. So if you want to do something like launch a web server that then can serve users, or if you want to batch process large amounts of data, those are things that are all provided in terms of compute services. And there are many different services, and we'll be exploring a few of these within this course. Then we have databases for situations where we have structured data that we need to be able to analyze and access. And there are multiple databases that are supported in the platform. Now, maybe at times we're looking at how we automate aspects of this and how we build a process around how we interact with the cloud. And in that case, we have Azure DevOps and an entire suite of services that gives us the ability to automate what we're doing from beginning to end. And maybe you're more interested in some advanced insights out of your data, and you want to look at the AI and machine learning capabilities that are provided. Maybe you want to deploy devices that have sensors that can gather data for you all around the world, and you're interested in the Internet of Things capabilities with IoT Central and IoT Hub. Chances are, whatever you're doing, you can do it better and more efficiently with the services that are provided by Azure. Now, one of the myths that I'll often hear from developers is misunderstanding and thinking that the platform is really only targeted at Windows developers. But in this case, if we look just at the different languages that are provided for the Azure SDKs, we see support for Java, as well as TypeScript and JavaScript, and Python, .NET, Go, and PHP. And if we want to look at one of even the newer services, what we have with Azure Functions, we can see that out of the box you have support for C#, JavaScript, F#, Java, PowerShell, Python, TypeScript. So we can see here first that this is not just a platform for .NET developers, not just a platform for Microsoft developers. Chances are there is a way to run a solution in whatever language you prefer on the platform. There's just some support for some languages out of the box. So let's begin to dive in and understand how Azure organizes its infrastructure globally. Now, a majority of the work that goes on behind the scenes to make Azure a viable platform around the world, you don't have to worry with. You will never have to deal with understanding how different data centers are connected, understanding the underlying configuration layer, understanding how data flows. All of that gets managed for you without you having to even think about it. But there is a concept you will need to be familiar with, and that's the concept of Azure regions. So according to Microsoft, an Azure region is a set of data centers deployed within a latency-defined perimeter and connected through a dedicated regional low-latency network. In other words, this is a set of data centers that work together within a geographic area. And when you're going to deploy a solution onto the platform, you're going to need to select the region where you want it to be deployed. Let's quickly take a global look at the infrastructure. So first of all, we have several regions that are currently launched for Azure. Here you can see these regions around the world. You can see that we have many different regions within the United States. Europe has several. We have several in Asia. There's a lot of support for Azure all around the globe. Chances are, wherever you're at, there is a region near you. Now, in addition to these regions, we also have several that have been announced. And depending on when you're watching this, these might have already launched by this point. But we see we have new regions here in Mexico and Spain and a few in the Middle East. Now, this gives us overall 58 regions worldwide. And of those, that means you have access to Azure really for 140 different countries. Now, an important thing to note here, not all of these regions are available to you. Some of these regions are not available to the public because they are for specific government uses. Now, let's talk a little bit more about what Azure manages for these regions. So out of the box, you don't have to worry about concepts like power. The platform takes care of making sure that each region is going to have the power that it needs, as well as networking and hardware. They take care of things like physical security, who can actually access these data centers and who can't, and even the underlying layers that handle things like virtualization. So when you're using a platform like Azure, these are things you don't even have to worry about. Now, there are two additional infrastructure concepts that I want to make you familiar with. However, you won't need to know these in depth for this course. So first we have geographies, and these are groupings of regions that enable organizations to make sure that they have compliance with regulations. So you might have a law that says that your data needs to reside within a certain country, and you need to have an assurance that if you put it in one of a few different regions, that will remain true. So this is the concept of geographies. Now, another concept that has to do with high availability applications is the concept of availability zones. So some regions support these separate physical locations that utilize separate resources, meaning separate power, separate networking, so that you can ensure high availability within that region. So next, we're going to discuss the Azure services that we're going to be leveraging within this course. Now, first of all, let's talk about some different cloud computing models that exist, because this will factor into how we leverage the platform. So first of all, let's imagine that we have a spectrum that goes from left to right. And on the far left end of the spectrum, we have maximum control, meaning that we can do whatever we want in the cloud exactly as we want to do it. But with that, we're going to own having to maintain that long term and making sure that we keep it up and running. But on the far right, we have minimum maintenance, where we might have to build our application in a slightly different way than we would have originally, but we don't have to do nearly as much to make sure that it stays running. Let's talk about this in terms of actual terms on the spectrum. So on the far left, we have what we call infrastructure as a service. And we're actually going to be launching a virtual machine within this specific module, and that is following an infrastructure as a service model. This means that we get access to those underlying servers, but we have to configure them, maintain the OS, install patches, but we can configure that server to run however we would like. Now, on the far right, we get the other end of the spectrum, and that's software as a service, or SaaS. That means we get to use a service like maybe Gmail, for example, where we don't have to worry with any of the underlying services at all. We simply get to use a piece of software that's given to us. And there are some services on Azure that are implemented in a software as a service model. Now, in between those two, we get in some ways the best of both worlds, and that's with platform as a service. And that means that while we will have to maintain a little bit more than we will with software as a service, we also will gain a little bit more control in the process. So here within this particular course, here's what we're going to be implementing. So in terms of your Node.js applications, we're going to cover how you deploy, how you then monitor, how you manage, troubleshoot, and then ultimately scale your applications. Now to do this, we're going to be looking at 4 different categories of services. So first we have databases, and here we'll be looking at how we leverage Azure SQL as well as Cosmos DB, which is a document-based database. Then, from a compute perspective, we'll be looking at how we leverage app services and Azure functions. We'll then be looking at automation and how we leverage the Azure CLI as well as Azure DevOps. And finally, we'll be looking at just raw virtual machines or infrastructure as a service, and we'll be implementing that here within this module. So the first step that we need to take before we can dive into Azure is to look at how we can create an Azure subscription. So here's what we're going to be doing within this clip. First of all, we're going to be creating a new Azure subscription. And then we're going to be reviewing the resources that Microsoft provides for new subscriptions. So let's dive in. So I'm here in the browser and I'm at azure.microsoft.com. And you'll see here that there's a big green Start Free button. So I'm going to click on that button. And here you can see I'm at a page that is highlighting the resources that Microsoft makes available to new subscriptions. So if I scroll down, they're going to show me three things that I get. First, there are 12 months of popular free services. So many of their most popular services on the platform, they've given you a set of things that you can do within this initial 12 months and use them totally for free. In addition to that, there is a $200 credit. So for services beyond those free services or beyond the free capacity they've given you, you can use this credit. Now, once your credit is done, you can transition your subscription to a pay-as-you-go subscription. And this will give you access to use anything you want on Azure, but you will pay for those resources as you use them. But here, while you're in this trial period, you can use that $200 credit. And that $200 credit will be more than enough to complete everything that we have included within this course. Now, another important note here, if you or your company are an MSDN subscriber, you might have additional Azure credits that are available to you. So be sure to check with your subscription or check with your employer to see what resources you can leverage. Now, once you've seen this, you can scroll down this page and begin to look at the different products that are free within that initial 12-month period. And this means potentially 5 gigabytes of file storage, or SQL database up to 250 gigabytes, you can see all of the things that are provided here. It also will give you a list of the services that are always free. Things like a 5 gigabyte Azure Cosmos DB and 1 million requests per month for a function. So those are the different types of things that it will show you on this page. Once you are ready to actually create your subscription, you can scroll back to the top and simply click on the Start Free button. Now, an important note here, you will have to have a credit card to create your subscription, but you won't be charged anything during your trial period. You won't be charged anything until you transition over to a pay-as-you-go subscription. So in this clip, we're going to walk through the process of how you leverage the Azure portal now that you have a subscription that you can leverage. So here we will first be walking through how you access the Azure portal. We'll then be reviewing your subscription settings and showing where you can go view those. Then I'll be customizing the portal experience and finally viewing the resources that you have launched in Azure on your account. So I'm here within the browser and I'm simply going to go to portal.azure.com. Now once I'm here, I'll need to log in with my account and then I can hit sign in. And this will launch me into the default view for Azure. Now I want to point out several things. First of all, I want to point out that we have the Azure page header, and this is going to be present all the time when we are navigating through. So if at any point there's something that you need to do that maybe is normally here on this initial home page, you can search for it here from within the search box in the header. In addition, I also want to call out that over at the far left, we have the Azure portal menu, and you can access that at any point by simply clicking on this button at the top left of the page header. So when you do, you'll see that there are several items that are provided. Some of them are here by default, including home and dashboard, as well as creating a resource. But then you have the opportunity underneath to add in your favorite services. Now there are several things that are provided here by default, but this is customizable. Now, Azure provides so many different services, you're not going to see every single thing listed here. And this is where the search box at the top of the page header can be beneficial in helping you find what you need. But if it is something that you use on a regular basis, you can choose to go in and add this in to your favorites. Now, in addition, I want to point out over at the far right, you have the ability to go in and see your user account. So if I click on my name in the top right, I'm going to be given an option to see my account as well as to log out here of the portal. Now I'm going to navigate over to the gears icon here within the page header. So from here within this menu, I am able to go in and customize my experience with the portal. It gives you the opportunity to change things like how often it signs you out when you're inactive, as well as changing your default view. For now, we have home selected. That means that we're going to be able to see this view anytime we log in to the portal. However, you might later have a custom dashboard that you've configured with specific information that you're interested in, and you could choose to change that to your default view. In addition, you could change the mode for the portal menu to, instead of being a flyout like it currently is, it could be docked, in which case you would always be able to see it. We'll choose to leave it as a flyout for now. In addition, you can go in and change your theme. If you prefer to have more of a dark mode, you can choose to set that here as well. So these are valuable settings that will help customize the experience for you as you work with Azure. Now, another thing I want to point out, there will be times, especially as you're launching new resources, where you will be getting notifications from the platform. Those notifications will be coming in here within this item, and you'll be able to see a log of those notifications, and it also will show you an icon if there are current notifications that you haven't yet viewed. So this gives you a high-level overview of initially how we would actually navigate within the Azure portal. Now, one of the things I want to show you how to do next is I want to show you where to go look for your subscription settings. Now, you can see here that I have an option here for subscriptions on the home page. But as I mentioned before, if you don't see this option, you can always go here under the search bar and simply type in subscriptions. From here, we can click on subscriptions and we can go in and see our information. Now, I have a single subscription applied to this account. You could certainly have more than one subscription. If, for example, you might want to divide your different usage in Azure based on different clients that you have, you could certainly do that and have different subscriptions for them. But in this case, I have a pay-as-you-go account that is specific for the work that I do here for Pluralsight courses. So this is where I go in to see information for my subscription. And if I click on this, this will allow me to go in and see information about the amount that I've been billed, as well as looking at historical costs that have been associated with this subscription. So now I'm going to navigate back to home. Now, the next thing I want to show you is something that will be valuable for you as you navigate this course. There may be times that we have you set up different pieces of infrastructure for this course, and we want to make sure that you actually spin those things down. We don't want to use more of your $200 credit than what we need to use. So if you want to have one place that you can go to, where you can see everything that has been launched on your Azure account, you can click on the option here for all resources. When you click on this, it will give you a list of resources that are currently on your account. And if you have multiple subscriptions, you can choose to go in and actually filter this based on each specific subscription that you have. Now, in this case, because this is a very simple account that I use only for the work that I do with Pluralsight, I only have a single subscription, and right now I only have a single resource that is spun up. But here, this is where you can go in and find the resources that you've launched. So if you want to have one place to go where you make sure you can see all of your resources and that you can delete them from this spot so that you are no longer charged from them, this is the location. You can get there from the home screen. You also can search for all resources from within the search bar within the page header. Now, the next step that we're going to take is we're going to create a virtual machine on Azure. Now, if you remember, we talked about infrastructure as a service, as a different cloud model. And this is what we're going to be leveraging here within this clip, is setting up just a plain virtual server that we can run Node.js on. So here's what we're going to be doing. First, we will be launching the virtual machine. Now, to do that, we're going to have to review several concepts. For example, looking at virtual machine sizes and series on Azure, as well as looking at topics like resource groups, and we're going to be configuring public key authentication to access our server. So let's dive in. So I'm here in the portal, and I see that I have virtual machines here on my homepage. But as mentioned before, I could simply go in and search for this as well. I'm going to select the option here for virtual machines. Now I don't have any virtual machines currently under this account. So I'm going to go in and click the Add option. Now when I do, it's going to walk me through the process of creating a virtual machine. Now I'll go ahead and tell you, we're not going to look at every single option that is available when creating a virtual machine, but we are going to hit the most critical ones that you will need to actually be able to get a virtual machine up and running. Now the first thing that you'll need to do is you will need to select your subscription. And this is important because if you have multiple subscriptions, this is going to dictate under which subscription you're actually going to be charged for this resource. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new resource group. We're going to call this Test VM. Now a resource group is just a logical grouping of the resources that you have in Azure. And this is important. Let's talk about how you might use this. If you are working with multiple clients, you might choose to group each individual project under a resource group. Doing this makes it very easy for you to go in and manage these as a group. For example, if you're doing a test like we're doing right now, we can choose to create a resource group for this, and when we're done with the test, we can go in and delete every resource that is associated with this resource group. It just makes it that much easier to know what resources are associated with which project you're working on. So I'll click OK. Now the next thing I'll need to do is I'll need to give the virtual machine a name. I'll also call this Test VM. Now the next thing here is that you're going to need to select the region. Now I'm going to leave it at East US, but you can go through here and see all of the different regions that are available to you, the regions where you can choose to launch this virtual machine into. In most cases, it makes sense to have this be near where you're at, or where your client is located at, or you expect the users that are going to be using this server to be located at. Because the closer they are physically to the server, generally the less latency you're going to see in that communication with the server. Now I'm not going to select anything for availability options because we're not looking at creating a high availability environment at this point. But the next thing we need to look at is the image. Now there are several different images that are provided, and we're actually going to stick with the one that is selected here by default, which is an Ubuntu 18.04 LTS version. But you could go in and browse all of the different images that are available. And there are different types of images. You can choose to leverage some that are just base OS versions. But you could also choose to leverage some that have been pre-configured for specific tasks. Like here, you can go in and see that we have the Wowza streaming engine that's available, for example. And you can see all of the different categories here within the marketplace that you can go in and launch. But in this case, we will choose to leave it just at the default value that we had previously, which is the Ubuntu server 18.04. Now the next thing we need to look at is the size, because the size will dictate a couple of things that you probably care about. First, the size will dictate the resources that are available to your virtual machine, including your CPU capacity and the memory that the server has. But maybe even more important for that is this will also dictate the cost, so what your server will actually cost to run on Azure. So we can click on the option here to change size. Now by default, it has selected some different types of servers for us that we can choose between. Now you'll see on the left we have VM size, and this is a string that just indicates the name of a specific VM size. For example, we currently have selected a D2S v3. Now the first letter indicates the series, and there are different series that are available. For example, the D series is just a general purpose series for VMs, where the F series is one that is compute optimized. So if you're doing something that's going to be really heavy on that compute, like maybe you're transcoding some videos, the G series is going to be something that is memory optimized. So if you're doing something that's really in depth from a memory perspective, and the N series has GPU capabilities that are included with it, and that might be really valuable if you're doing some machine learning activities. Now there are many more series beyond the ones I've just listed here. In this case, we will choose to keep it at the default value that was previously selected, which is a D2S v3. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to decide how we're going to actually connect to our virtual server. This is important because if you don't get this part right, Once you launch your server, you won't be able to do anything with it. Now I'm going to choose to have SSH public key authentication. In most cases, that's just a better choice than using a password. So I'm quickly going to switch over to my terminal, and I'm going to choose to go in and get the public key of a key that I've already created for this specific account. And when I do, I'm going to copy the key value, and then I'm going to go back over to the browser. From here, I'm going to paste this in, and then I'm going to enter in a username. Now you'll see here that it is validating both my username and the public key. Both of those have green check marks, so we're good to go. Now at this point, we do have the option to go in and configure inbound ports. Now we can go in and do a lot more with this later, but for now, we want to be sure that SSH and HTTP are both open and available for our server. Now we could walk through many different options, including looking at storage and networking and many other things. But for now, we have entered the base information that we need to be able to create our virtual machine. Now, if you want to step through, as I mentioned, you can see all of the different options that you can configure here, from disks, networking, management, some advanced capabilities, tags, all of those things are available. But since we've entered in the information that's needed, we can simply click Review and Create. And we can see here that there is an option missing in Management. So I'm going to click on this option, and it's letting us know here that we need to create a diagnostics storage account. And in this case, for now, we will simply click Off for Boot Diagnostics, and that will actually take this option away from us, so we won't need to fill it in just yet. And then we'll hit Review and Create. And now we can see that our validation has passed and we're ready to launch our virtual server. And we can see here that it is deploying. This deployment is currently in progress. So here within the next clip, we'll be walking through the process of connecting to this virtual machine and beginning to work in it. So in the last clip, we walked through the process of actually starting the deployment of a virtual machine on Azure. And here within this clip, we're going to connect to that virtual machine and begin to actually work in it. So here's what we're going to do. First, we will log into that virtual machine, as I mentioned. We will also review how you find the resources that you've launched within the Azure portal. And then we'll look at how, in a very quick way, we simply host an Express app on our virtual machine and make it available over the web. So let's dive in. So you can see here that our deployment of our virtual machine is complete. In addition, you can see that we do have a notification here within the portal letting us know that this deployment process has completed. But we're going to choose to ignore both of these screens for the moment, and we're going to go back to Home. Because here, I want to point out how we get back to that resources list that shows everything that we have included on our account. So first of all, I'm going to bring this up. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to filter by resource group. If you remember, I mentioned that a resource group is a logical grouping of resources within Azure. And so from here, I'm going to go in and just select Test VM. And you can see here the different things that were launched as a part of this deployment. We do have our virtual machine. We also have a public IP address. We also have something called a network security group. And that's what configures the ports that are available. If you remember, we made both port 22 for SSH and port 80 for HTTP available to our virtual server. We also have a virtual network, a network interface, and a disk. So all of these things were launched by simply launching one virtual machine. Now the next thing I'm going to do from here is I'm going to click on the virtual machine. And when I do, you can see here that I get the detail information about my virtual machine. I can go in here in the center and I can see all of the information, such as seeing the status, so I know that it's running. I can see that it is in the East US region. I can see that it is associated with my Pluralsight subscription. I can see the name I've given it, the operating system, the size that I chose, and I also can see things like the public IP address. Now, if I wanted to, I could simply click on the stop option to just totally stop this VM. But in this case, I actually want to connect to it and I want to work with it. And so to do that, I'm going to click on the connect option. Now it's not going to connect me to the server right away. What it's going to do is it's going to give me some information on how I can connect into the server. So from here, it's given me the information about how I need to actually connect to this server. And in this case, we're going to use this command ssh-i, put in our private key path, and then log in with our username and the public IP address. I'm going to copy this piece here at the end because I'll paste that directly into the terminal. So now let's navigate over to the terminal. So here I've already referenced the key that I'll be using to connect to the server, and now I'll actually paste in the string that I got from the portal. Once I do, it's going to let me know if I want to accept this fingerprint. I'll say yes. And now I have to enter in the passphrase for my key. Now that I've entered in the passphrase, I am now connected to the server. So now that I'm connected to the server, I actually can begin working with it. I want to quickly run a very basic Node application. And one of the ways I can do that is by using Express Generator. Now, to make this happen though, I need to install a few things on this server. First, I'm going to update the package manager. Then I'm going to go in and install both Node.js and npm. Once that is completed, I can now install the Express Generator. And I'm going to install that globally here on this machine. Now that I have that, I can simply type in Express and test, and this is going to create a sample Express application within the test directory. Now that that's created, I can change into that directory, and we can install the dependencies. Now I'm going to go ahead and launch this Express application so that we can test it. But to do this, I'm going to need to pass in an environment variable that dictates the port that it's going to use. Now we just want to have this go on port 80 so that we can access it just as a normal website. However, to do that and to be able to launch this on port 80, we're going to need to do this as root. So I'm going to start off by saying sudo, and then we're going to set port to be 80, and then we're going to say npm run start. And now we actually have this up and running on port 80. So now I'm going to navigate back to the browser. And from here, I'm going to take this public IP address, I'm going to open a new tab, I'm going to paste it in, and now we can see our sample Express application up and running. So just in this limited amount of time, we've been able to launch a virtual machine, and we have a Node application up and running on this virtual machine. Now this might seem great, this might seem like, wow, we've solved all of our problems. But as we talked about earlier with infrastructure as a service, there's a lot of things that aren't managed for you by default by taking this approach. You would be responsible for making sure your Node application stays up and running. You would be responsible for maintaining the underlying OS and making sure that it stays updated. You would be responsible for what happens when it's not up and running. There's so many things you would need to handle here. So we're going to be looking over this course at several different ways that you can launch your Node.js applications in Azure. Now, in the next clip, we're going to be walking through the process of how we actually spin down this virtual machine and how we leverage the Azure CLI. Now, up to this point, we have been working within the Azure portal, the web interface that allows us to configure how we're leveraging Azure. And you might be tempted to think that this is just the way you interact with Azure, but that is not the case. In reality, Azure is simply a set of REST APIs that you can interact with to launch new resources. And in addition to that, there are other ways you can leverage those APIs. You could go in, for example, and utilize the SDKs that are included. They have provided SDKs across a number of different languages that could automate the way that you interact with Azure. But there also is the Azure Command Line Interface, or CLI, that we can use to interact with the platform, and that's what we're going to be covering within this clip. So here's what we're going to be doing. First of all, we will be installing the Azure CLI onto our local machine, and then we'll be logging into the CLI. We'll be executing commands on the CLI, and then we'll be looking at a different way that we can interact with the CLI, and that is using the Azure Cloud Shell. So let's dive in. So I'm here in my browser, and I'm looking at the instructions here for how to install the Azure CLI. And you can see here that there are options for Windows, Mac, and Linux. In this case, because I'm on Mac, I'm going to choose this option, but let me call out something first. One of the great things about the CLI is that it works exactly the same on any of these different platforms, and the command structure is exactly the same. So if you're going to script different ways that you're interacting with Azure, those can actually run across Windows or Mac or Linux. So in this case, I'm going to go to Install on Mac OS because I'm currently on a Mac. And you can see here that there is an option for installing with Homebrew. I can simply run this command if I have Homebrew installed, and that will install the Azure CLI. Now I've actually already installed it on this machine. So I'm going to navigate over to the terminal, and I know that I have it installed because I can run the command AZ, and then we'll see the output of the command. Now this gives us all of the different subcommands that are included. If we go in and look here, we can see that they are arranged in alphabetical order, and we have things here all the way from account to virtual machine and a lot of different subcommands in between. Now the next thing we need to do before we can interact with any of these services is that we need to log in to our Azure CLI. And that's done using a combination of the command line and the browser. So I'm simply going to type AZ login. And this launches the browser in an interactive manner for me to select my account. And now it lets me know that I have logged into the Azure CLI. So now I'm going to navigate back over to the terminal. Perfect. And you can see that it has returned information here about my account. And it lets me know the different subscriptions that I have available. In this case, you can see that I have one subscription that it returns here in JSON format, and it is the Pluralsight subscription. And that's the one that we're going to be leveraging. So now that we've logged into the Azure CLI, we're now able to actually execute commands against our subscription. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I want to manage a VM, is I want to learn how to use the VM subcommand. So I'm going to type in AZ and then VM. Now this is not a valid command in and of itself, but it's going to return for me the different options of what I can do under this subcommand. And it gives me a huge list here. However, some of these might be a bit confusing. We might not know what all of these do. So if we want more information for any of the subcommands, we can simply add in -H. When we do, that'll now give us the help text for each of the commands under that subcommand. Now what we want to do here is we want to actually get rid of the virtual machine that we launched earlier within this module. Now there's several options here that you might look at, such as stop and deallocate, and you might wonder which one you need to use. Well, in this case, stop is just going to stop your virtual machine. It's just like turning it off. It doesn't mean that it's going to free up any of the resources that it's using. And that should matter to you because as long as those resources are allocated to your virtual machine, you will be paying for them. So in this case, we want to use the deallocate command to actually deallocate this virtual machine. So we're going to go in and type in AZ VM deallocate. Now this also is not a complete command, but we don't know what options we need to include. So we're simply going to run it like this, and it's going to let us know. And it's telling us here that we need to include one of two things. We can either include a combination of the resource group and the name, or we have to include the IDs. Now I don't remember the IDs off the top of my head. I actually could list those here from within the CLI and get them, but I know the resource group and the name. So I'm going to type in AZ VM deallocate resource group, and the resource group here is test VM. In addition, the name is also test VM. So now that I've entered in the resource group and the name, I'm in the VM subcommand, and then I'm doing the deallocate command under that. This should be a complete command that will deallocate the virtual machine that we launched previously within this module. And now it's letting us know that it is actually running this command. And so it will take just a bit for it to run through the process of actually deallocating this virtual machine. So now that our command has returned, we have deallocated our virtual machine by using the Azure CLI. Now to see the results of this, I'm going to go back into the browser. So from here, I'm going to go into all resources. We can see here that we have the same list that we had previously. We can even filter it down by going under resource group and making sure that we have only selected the test VM option. And from here, we can now see that we still have our virtual machine, but if we click on it, we can see here that its current status is deallocated. Now we could choose to restart it if we wanted to, but in this case, I'm going to go back under all resources. I'm going to select everything that we have associated with this particular resource group, and we'll go into delete. We'll need to type yes to confirm, but this will now delete all of the resources that we have created within our Microsoft Azure account over this initial module. Now there's one additional thing that I want to point out before we finish out this clip, is that you don't have to go to your local machine to use the Azure CLI. There is an option that is included within the CLI called the Cloud Shell. And here, this option is found within the header. So I'm going to click on Cloud Shell. So the Azure Cloud Shell launches a version of the CLI that you can interact with simply from within your browser. So the first time that you launch the Azure CLI, you're going to have to first set up a storage account, and then after that, you will need to select between either using Bash or PowerShell. Now, I spend a lot of my time working on my Mac and Linux servers, so I'm more familiar with Bash, but you could certainly leverage PowerShell if you so desire. And you can even switch later if you want to with this option in the top left. However, in this case, I'm going to stick with Bash. And this provides, again, a version of the Azure CLI we can use directly from within our browser. And we can see that this works by simply going in and typing AZ account list. And it already has integrated the login step for us because we're logged into the portal. And so in this case, it's going to return my subscriptions that I have for this particular account. And you can see here, it returns the Pluralsight subscription, which is the one that I have configured. And I would recommend for most users to get the Azure CLI installed on your local machine and also take advantage of the Cloud Shell if there's a situation where you don't have access to your machine. But this is a valuable tool that you'll be leveraging as you're working with Microsoft Azure. So we've covered quite a bit here within this initial module. So before we go any deeper, let's take a minute and look back at what we've covered. So first, we reviewed the capabilities of the Azure platform. We began to look at some of the different categories of services that are available, from storage to compute to databases to AI and machine learning to DevOps into the Internet of Things. And while we're only going to be using a small percentage of those overall services, it helped us understand the power that is provided by the platform as a whole. We also looked at how Microsoft organizes the global infrastructure for Azure. We understood the concept of regions and how we need to choose regions when we're deploying our code into the cloud. We then examined some of the different cloud computing models, and we talked about everything from IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, PaaS, and software as a service, SaaS. We also went through the process of creating an Azure subscription, which is going to be necessary for you to follow along with the work in this course. We then accessed the Azure portal and used it to actually launch a virtual machine. We went through the process to configure that virtual machine to our specifications, and then we were able to connect to it. And then ultimately, we utilized the Azure CLI to deallocate the virtual machine that we had launched in the cloud. And as we move forward in this course, we're going to be looking at the platform as a service approach offered by Azure App Service.